Yeah, 100%. And it's interesting that you noted as well that some of your bodybuilders were able to actually build muscle whilst also getting leaner, which is something that's the common heuristic of either building or cutting. So can you comment a little bit on that?
Yeah, absolutely. I think both from a research standpoint, but also my personal experience as a practitioner, that there is this idea that you're either building muscle or you're losing fat. You're not doing both of them. But my experiences would say that, well, no, actually you can, and I think a lot of people would find this as well, that you can build muscle and lose fat at the same time. Certainly these bodybuilders were able to do that. At least a minority of these bodybuilders were able to do that. And remember, these guys are already quite lean, and these guys typically have a lot of resistance training experience. So we're talking a number of years of training experience. One of the guys in particular, who ended up finishing third at an international sort of the world titles, he came in and he's in his early 40s now. He's got 20 or so years of bodybuilding experience, and he came in already fairly lean, but the total mass lost was more or less all fat mass, and in fact he gained lean mass in that 16-week period. So wow. This is an individual who typically you wouldn't be expecting someone to do that given his training age and how lean he already is. Certainly his approach to, and others' approach to resistance training and their dietary approach is very regimented, and it allows them to achieve that increase in lean mass whilst also reducing fat mass. So certainly it can be done. How do you do it? I think certainly that protein intake is very important. You can't neglect how important resistance training is as well. These guys are very strict with their training. They lift heavy, they lift often. They periodize their training. So that certainly is important from a dietary standpoint, though. Trying to minimize, I guess, the energy deficit that they're in, and also focusing a lot on their protein intake. And things that we talk about and they talk about, and things that we educate clients on and athletes on, is not just the overall total protein intake, but also your distribution of protein, the quality of the protein. And these bodybuilders, they're very good at that type of stuff. And if it's from their own experience or listening to other bodybuilders or talking to dietitians or whatever it is, they're very in tune with what they need to be doing in order to achieve these types of outcomes. So their diet is very well prepared. You could say it's strict, it's regimented in that they eat very similar foods on a day-to-day basis, but it is very well planned out, and it does allow them to achieve these types of outcomes whereby they can increase their lean mass in a 16-week period when they're looking to drop fat mass, and ultimately it ends up, they result in this ideal physique for a competition, a bodybuilding competition, in that they're meeting the criteria for being very lean, but they're also meeting that criteria for increased muscularity, for being in a muscular body composition, basically, which ultimately is what bodybuilders are looking to do.
100%, yeah. I mean, it is interesting that the 5 to 6 meals per day is obviously just well entrenched, and maximizing that protein pacing effect through the day and ensuring they're getting enough total is something that, just like you said, whether it's through evidence-based practitioners or even just their colleagues, is definitely something that's sort of hammered in. One of the things that stood out to me was the difference. I had Dr. Andrew Chappell on earlier this year, and he was in his study with the British bodybuilders. I think they were about 5 grams per kilogram of carbohydrates a day, and I was noticing in your study the Australian lifters were about, I think it was 3 grams per kg. Is that something you think that's maybe, is it cultural? I mean, I know Andrew had mentioned that in the USA they had lower carbohydrate intakes as well. Is it something that has to do with, today obviously more of a low carb environment in the blogosphere? What are your thoughts there?
Yeah, I don't know. I've actually been speaking to Andrew recently in the last couple of months, and we've been trying to tee some stuff up. And that was one of the things that he did bring up, that over there in the UK, and he's a bodybuilder himself and he's experienced it, that the carbohydrate intake is a little bit higher than what we found here. I think with these guys that we studied, but also another study where we spoke and interviewed with some experienced bodybuilders, their overall carbohydrate intake is not really significant. It's nowhere near an endurance athlete. It's not up towards that 5 or 6 gram per kilogram that Andrew is talking about. We, as you suggested, we found that they were about a 3 gram per kilogram mark, but they were using their carbohydrates very strategically, particularly as they got closer and closer to competition. What I mean by that is they're periodizing it around their training. So a majority of their carbohydrate intake is consumed pre and post their resistance training session. And a majority of the guys are lifting in the afternoon. If they're performing aerobic work, they're doing that in the morning. So they're eating a fairly moderate or a low carbohydrate intake during the day, and then they get to their sort of afternoon meal, where they're still having a high protein intake, but they're bumping up their carbohydrate intake there, and then they're going and lifting in the gym for an hour or so, a short time after that meal. And then again, they replenish their glycogen stores, so they consume a higher carbohydrate meal after their resistance training session. And that's where a majority of their carbohydrates are coming in, those 2 meals, so around the training session. And we know that they're trying to lose weight, so they're very conscious of their total energy intake. Obviously, if you bump your carbohydrate intake up, then that's going to result in increased energy intake if you're keeping everything else the same. So they're conscious of trying to moderate their energy intake and therefore moderate their carbohydrate intake, and use the carbohydrates strategically to ensure that they are training at their most effective way, so they can maintain intensity and volume of their training sessions without really blowing out with their energy intake from a total daily energy intake perspective. So I would suggest that's possibly a difference between here and what Andrew's finding over there in the UK. I can't talk into too much detail. I haven't looked at them specifically, but certainly when you look at a total grams per kilogram body weight, there is that difference there. I think you do need to put somewhat of an asterisk against the guys that we're looking at here, because, as I said, we did expect to get a lot more bodybuilders coming through the door to participate, but we didn't. Potentially the guys that are taking part in this research are going to be guys who are more evidence-based with their approach, guys, bodybuilders out there who are possibly following less evidence-based approaches. Potentially they're the guys who aren't going to be looking to participate in research for whatever reason. But the guys that we're measuring here, potentially not a reflection of the total bodybuilding population here in Australia, but certainly the guys who are experienced, the guys that we were involved with. And these guys, they train with other bodybuilders. They're in the gym. They've got bodybuilder friends that they talk to. They're the guys that seem to be following this sort of periodized approach with their carbohydrate intake, more evidence-based recommendations that they're using.
And that sort of dovetails into my next question here. You mentioned sort of the strategic use, obviously, of carbohydrates, before sessions to ensure being able to work out at a certain intensity and, of course, with recovery. But what about the refeed days in terms of having those bigger consumptions 1 or 2 days of the week? What did you find there with your bodybuilders?
Yeah, so that wasn't something, unfortunately, I really wish we would have been able to look at that in a little bit more detail. We did find that about half of the guys coming through were using refeed days in the 16-week and 8-week measurement periods. So that week, that peak week, we'll talk about that a little bit later, but certainly 8 weeks out and 16 weeks out, these guys were using these refeed strategies. So I guess for the listeners who aren't aware of that, a refeed days, they're in a long-term energy deficit because they're trying to lose fat mass, but they strategically use 1 or 2 days a week where they bump their energy intake back up to more or less their off-season values, and they use carbohydrate primarily in order to do that. They reported it was very beneficial. Unfortunately, we couldn't really look into specific details of how effective it was from a physiological standpoint, but they do report that they find it very effective in maintaining their loss of fat mass, so continuing fat mass loss, but also it's certainly a psychological thing for them. If anyone who's been on a diet before, you would probably understand that it can be quite demanding. When you include a day where you're going to be looking forward to it because you get to eat a little bit more, then certainly that will help with maintaining it and staying on your energy deficit, so the long-term weight loss approach. So that's certainly, I think it's a very important strategy that these guys were using, and it's something that they found very effective. They also try and use it strategically around some of their resistance training sessions. So when they do have a big day lifting, typically a lower body day, when they're going to be lifting heavy lower limb stuff, they'll use a refeed day around that training session. So they talk about trying to increase glycogen stores and increase a little bit more energy intake, carbohydrate intake, so they can really train and lift heavy on those big resistance day sessions. So they use that in conjunction with that type of heavy lifting day. Now, some guys were doing it once a week, other guys were doing it a couple of days a week. Do they do it 2 days in a row? Do you do it at different days during the week? There's a bit of variability there in what the guys were reporting doing. Some guys were strict Monday through Friday, and then Saturday, Sunday, they were their 2 refeed days. Not that they were blowing out, but certainly they could relax a little bit more on those 2 refeed days over the weekend. In terms of what does the evidence suggest, I don't think there is enough evidence at this point in time to say what the best approach is, but certainly anecdotally from these bodybuilders, it's very effective. And I guess this is putting my clinician's hat on at the moment. If an individual reports something working, then go with it. If there isn't evidence to show it just yet, then who cares if, if they find it really effective and it's beneficial for them, then stick with it.